Good evening. Welcome to this week's Global Christian Perspectives with, as is usual, myself, Chris Hare, and Elgin Hushbeck from the opposing sides of politics and the Atlantic. A number of items have come up this week. The first I have on my sheet is the likelihood of both Saudi Arabia and Turkey now putting ground troops into the Syrian conflict. This is a worrying development from my point of view. We are, of course, substantially closer to there than you are in the States, but obviously Turkey is a member of NATO and a US ally. And we have Russia and, of course, Iran supporting Assad and Hezbollah, who are clearly on opposite sides. The Kurds sort of caught in the middle, and everybody seems to need them, but nobody wants them, particularly Turkey. What's your feeling on this, Elgin?
My feeling is that this is one of those situations that has been allowed to fester far too long, and thus at the moment I don't really see any good options whichever way you go. It's one of those early on, I don't think ISIS should have ever been allowed to arise in the first place. Then once it started, I think it could have been stopped at many points along the way, but it was essentially ignored until combined into the ongoing problems in Syria, which is kind of a separate issue, but not really at this point. And now we just got a huge mess, and I'm not really sure. I think we need to do something. I have my ideal solution with the democracies of the world would come together and basically put an end to ISIS, but I just don't ever see that actually. They're much more likely to, pass a resolution in the UN condemning ISIS and think that'll actually solve something. So, barring that, the only other options is somebody has to go in there and try to do it alone. I don't think the United States is going to do that, even if we went in with our allies of Britain and Europe and around the world. So you're pretty much left to either waiting until it gets to be a bigger problem or trying to form. If you're Saudi Arabia, you've got to be very concerned about all of this. Quite frankly, I've been seeing reports that Saudi Arabia and Israel are beginning to work together on this problem. So yeah, that's getting really strange bedfellows. So
it is indeed.
What's that?
It is indeed. That surprises me. There are a load of power dynamics going on there. Saudi Arabia thinks it's a protector of Sunni Muslims apart from Islamic State, which obviously would be a competitor if it really took off. Turkey would like to be in that position too. So that's a natural liaison. But obviously the Kurds are not on the same side because although they're Sunni, they're an ethnic group. Then we've got the lineup of the Shia Muslim Iran trying to protect its small enclave in Syria, which has been on the top of the heap. We don't seem to have a similar set of Christian nations wanting to protect the Christian minorities in Syria and Iraq, which have been having an exceptionally difficult time. But
yeah, I don't think it's that they don't want to protect the Christian nations. or the Christian communities in there. I think it's that they don't want to do anything, because there's really only one way to go in and protect them, and that's just, you're going to have to use troops, somebody's troops. I think I think early on we could have done an awful lot by helping the Kurds. The Kurds in that area were very pro-Western, very they are our most likely ally in that region, but instead of help, we basically said, no, we're not going to give you any help unless you can get it out of Baghdad, and Baghdad wasn't willing to help them. So essentially not much happened. And again, now I think ISIS is getting so large that there's not much you can do with them without serious military force, which now you're talking either large coalitions or the United States.
Yeah. I have to admit that I wouldn't support a coalition of Christian nations going in with troops on the ground for anything other than a purely protective endeavour. And a protective endeavour in that area would turn into something that wasn't a protective endeavour. I think I agree with your early comment that it's something which maybe could have been nipped in the bud earlier, but at this point, it's an apparently insoluble problem, because I don't see a way in which you can align Russia, Iran, the States, Saudi, and Turkey and the Kurds all together in one alliance. There are just too many tensions going on there.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I'm afraid that if you don't do, it's sort of World War II. 1933, 34, 35. You could have done something probably without even military to stop it. Then, as the further you get, the more military you would have had to use, until eventually we actually did start using military, but by then it was too far, too late, and we had a huge world war on ourselves. I mean, one of the things that got me about that was when Hitler went into the Rhineland. They had orders to the troops, the German tanks, that if you saw any movement from the French, turn around and come back. And the analysis I've read of that is that would have been such a humiliating defeat for Hitler that he would have probably fallen from power, and we never would have had World War II without firing a shot. I think that moment is well past, and I'm not saying we're going to get into a huge world war, but rule it out either. You've got Soviet Union, you've got Iran. I think Iran, with the new agreement, is almost certain to get nuclear weapons. So, I don't think you can rule out a much larger conflict than what we even have now. But it's certainly something needs to be done, something decisive. And unfortunately, I don't see any world leaders out there who can stand up and make the decisions and take the political heat that it's going to have to take to solve this problem.
Yeah, we've already, of course, seen a NATO member shooting down a Russian military plane, which is closer to direct conflict than I would prefer, frankly. Yes. So, yes, no easy solutions on that one, then.
No, I think it's the lesson to learn here is a little prevention can oftentimes, I think, for example, if we had left troops, 10,000 troops, which is what the military leaders were asking for, we left 10,000 troops in Iraq, that ISIS would never have arisen, and the situation there would resemble Korea probably much more than it resembles Vietnam, which is unfortunately where it's ending up.
Okay. But while we're talking about international affairs, Henry was suggesting that we We have a talk about the political dynamic in Asia as India is moving up and China is just continuing to grow in influence. There's obviously room for conflict. There is sort of subterranean conflict round about the China Sea from time to time, but it never really seems to take off too much. The only thing that we could hang it on that's recent is India's banning Facebook's Free Basics program recently, which sort of indicates to me that India is maybe not quite as internationalistically inclined as one might like in certain directions. What's your feeling about the situation there?
Well, I've mentioned the growing tensions of South China Sea several times in previous broadcasts, and to me, this is just one more indication of the problem that we're having with the United States. Was whether we like it or not, the United States is the world's policeman. I don't particularly like that term, but it kind of is, and we've been pulling back under the term of Obama, and I think what we're seeing basically, if the police pull out of a neighborhood, what happens to the neighborhood? We see this in the Crimea. We see this. The South China Sea. We see it growing because I think any potential conflict with China is still a long ways off, and there's room. Going back to that World War II analogy, we're much closer to 1933 than we are to 1939. So there's room to maneuver. There's time to do something. The particular problem in the South China Sea is they're going out and they're building islands out of nothing. They're going into the middle of the ocean in international waters. They're literally a small little around that. And if you consider the size of the South China Sea and the fact that it's one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, it doesn't imagine that they would have to build too many islands until suddenly you can't get anywhere without crossing China's territorial waters. So I do think Obama has done some pretty good action here in recent months by deliberately sailing ships through that area, making the point that this is international waters. Even if they do build an island there, it's an artificial island. It's not really subject to the 12-mile limit. And so by taking that stance in a visible fashion, they're basically declaring that this is establishing the pattern that China's claims to territorial waters are not valid, which I don't think they are. But it's definitely an area of growing tension as their economy continues to decline. One of the things we know from history is when economies decline, rulers like to distract the population. We see this happening in Russia right at the moment with the fall of oil prices. We see this happening in China with some other ongoing problems there. So it's definitely an area of concern. I don't think it's quite as bad as the ISIS problem that we just finished talking about.
Okay. Yeah, I have to say I don't really feel that the United States has been cutting back very significantly on military. As I recall, it still spends as much as the next 4 or 5 countries put together, and could probably take them all on at the same time at present.
Well, let me give you one little statistic. The average age of one of our planes in the Air Force, which is, by the way, our Air Force is going to be the smallest we've ever had. And the average age of a plane, I think I heard the other day, is something around 27 years old, which means most of the pilots are flying planes that are older than they are. I'm no spring chicken, and there are actually planes that are older than me. So, there are planes that people's fathers and maybe even some cases grandfathers flew, and now they are flying the same plane. So our Navy is likewise declining, but across the board, we're cutting drastically to the point that we can no longer do the things we used to do simply because we don't have the resources.
But you seem to be spending an incredible amount of money not doing things in that.
Well, part of that is true. Part of that is true. There's definitely some spending problems in terms of, for example, how long it takes to build an aircraft carrier or commission a plane, and we can get into the bureaucracy of that. But part of the problem is, quite frankly, when they talk about the defense budget, Congress learned a long time ago it can stick things into the defense budget, and even though they're not really defense, and so there's a lot of stuff that goes under the heading of defense that really you and I would look at it and scratch our head and says, what's that doing there? Mm-hmm. The other big trend that's been going on is the military. For example, the Pentagon, most of the people in the Pentagon are no longer military. They're civil service, which has a whole nother, cost issue involved. It inflates the cost of things incredibly. And there's things like where somebody will retire and then get hired back immediately in the same significant of that.
Yeah. I don't know.
I would give you one other little statistic. Is back in the 80s, we spent 6% of the GDP, gross national product, on defense.
Okay.
We're currently down under 3%. So in terms of our gross national product, we have decreased our defense spending considerably.
Want to guess how much as a percentage of GDP ours is?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Do you want to guess as a percentage of GDP what our defense spending is?
Probably pretty low.
It's about 1 at the moment.
Yeah. Well, quite frankly, one of the things that's happened is, particularly in Europe, you've been able to have very small GDPs and defense spendings because you've got the NATO alliance and you've been relying on us. So we picked up that mantle. You used to have it for several hundred years, and then after World War II, we picked up the mantle. So.
One of the things that bothers me about anything we say about the China and India spheres of influence is that whereas we are talking about previously, for instance, with Russia, we're talking about historically Orthodox Christian viewpoints. Anything to do with Europe, South America, we're talking about, broadly speaking, Christianized nations. We've got some acquaintanceship with Islam because they've been a threat to the south of Europe for a very long time now. We're not necessarily so used to dealing with the kind of philosophies that we may be seeing from the Indians, and in particular from the Chinese, whose thinking processes do not seem to be necessarily quite the same as ours. Do you see that as a really major problem, Elgin?
Well, I think it does, because if you don't understand your enemy, you don't know how to react to them. I'm not really saying China's an enemy yet, but they're an adversary at least. And if you understand them, you know how to respond in a way that will prevent misunderstandings, and you can tamp down the conflict as opposed to making it bigger. But one of the issues going on in China is I don't know if China knows what its internal philosophy is. There seemed to be, I remember Henry Kissinger came out with a book on China a few years ago, and he argued that there's a conflict going on within China leadership as to, I can't quite remember the terms he used, but essentially those who want to get along with the West more and those who want to take a more adversarial view towards the West. And that battle hasn't been settled yet. And so if we can understand better what they're doing, maybe we can take actions that will help without, directly going in and meddling on, gunboat diplomacy or anything like that. But maybe we can take actions that will encourage the side that would be more accommodative to Western influences and basically not encourage the side that would be more hostile to Western influence or Western nations. Mm-hmm. Bottom line, the better we know them, the more likely. It's just like your, married couples. Why do they fight so often? They don't know how to work with each other yet. And as they learn more and more about each other, they can get along and work in harmony in areas that used to be areas of conflict. And I think that requires that you take the time to understand the people that you're having trouble with. Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I don't think we understand those countries very well.
No, and I have some worries about India, which has been cropping up on my radar a number of times recently. One, because its new leadership is reasonably extreme Hindu nationalist, and does not believe in that other religions, for instance, are appropriate in India at all. I've noticed that they significantly discourage outside companies buying bits of Indian industry these days, whereas there are bits of Indian industry which are buying significant industries elsewhere, notably their Tata Corporation, which bought British Steel some years ago and has now closed most of it.
Yeah.
And their policy towards incomers, unless you're Indian, you can't actually buy a house in India. You can only rent, for instance. We're looking at a sort of insular protectionist attitude in a global market. That sort of encourages me to start hankering after the days of protection myself, because it's a one-way competition at present.
Yeah, it is very difficult, and although quite frankly, I think that's more the norm. I think what we're seeing is the pullback of British and then now currently American influence in the world, and not just militarily, but in general. And we're seeing essentially the true nature of nations arise. This what we're moving into is actually much more historical, and in terms of long term, the last several hundred years of British and now American control have actually been the aberration. So, but we've grown used to that. Unless you spend a lot of time, studying history, then you end up, it's kind of interesting because an author here just published a book about Thomas Jefferson and the Barbary Pirates, and you read through that and you realize that the conflict with Islam is not something that just started. It existed back then, and of course you can go back to the Battle of Tours in 800 AD. So, or I guess the last time Muslim forces attacked Europe was in the 1760s, and they got as far as Vienna.
Indeed.
So this is we see this since we went through following the attack on Vienna. We've seen this lull, and we take this lull as the norm, when in reality it's been the aberration. And what we're getting back to with Islam is actually, unfortunately, has been the norm for most of the history of Islam.
Mhm. Well, for a while, the Muslim power was the Ottoman Empire, and it basically rotted. And while it was in the process of rotting, nothing much was going to come out of there. It has fallen apart, and of course, harking back to our first item, a resurgent Turkey has thoughts in its mind of the past as the dominant Muslim power, which I think probably wants watching in itself.
Yeah.
I'm more worried about ISIS currently, but Turkey could be a problem in itself.
Yeah, particularly since Turkey is a little bit like China in the sense of it's in the throes of its own internal struggle. It was once held up as the model of how a Muslim country could actually be democratic and could enter into NATO because of Ataturk and the reforms. But in recent years, it's seemed to drift more towards radical, is a more radical form of Islam. But now there's some signs that maybe that's being rejected, and they're maybe coming back to a more, secular version of Islam. But that's an unknown at this point. Which way will they go? And that's depending on which way they go, could have a massive impact on future relations.
We may like to hold that line of thinking until the second half, actually, because it's got some throughput into the next item. However, having reached the halfway point, it's customary for us to introduce ourselves and what we do, and particularly any books we have. I'm Chris Eyre. I'm an Energian editor, and I blog at airlines.energian.net, and occasionally argue with Elgin on the Energian Discussion Network. Elgin.
Well, I'm Elgin Hushbeck, and I've 4 books with Energian, 2 on the Bible and 2 on politics. And I also write a bi-monthly or twice-a-month column for the Energian Discussion Network.
Splendid. With that, a couple of linked, slightly political, slightly religious items from the States. The one thing that first I noticed was Ted Cruz saying that he was a Christian first and an American second. And I was wondering about this as an attitude for a presidential candidate. Would we, for instance, be looking on somebody the same if, for instance, they said they were a Muslim first and an American second?
I think it would depend, at least for me, I think it would depend significantly on what they meant by a Muslim. I mean, because there are Muslims who are completely American. They are patriotic. They love this country. They support the values of this country. On the other hand, there's a strain of Islam that is incompatible with the American culture. It's incompatible with the American values. If you are a Muslim who wants to impose Sharia law as your governing document, then that's incompatible with the American Constitution, and therefore I would be very troubled by that. On the other hand, if someone says I'm a Muslim and I'm a Muslim first, but I love this country and I support the values of the American Constitution, then I wouldn't have any problem at all. So when he says that, quite frankly, I find it a bit refreshing, because oftentimes politicians use religion more as a, state you're religious, kiss the baby, move on to the next speech. It's just something they check off, and it's used where it's convenient. They think they might get them votes, and then it's ignored in the areas when it's not. so to have Cruz come up, there's a sense of refreshing honesty about that. You know where he stands, and he's a constitutional lawyer. He's argued something like 12 cases before or 9 cases before the Supreme Court. I have no doubt about his view of the Constitution, and in particular, for example, the First Amendment and the Free Exercise Clause on religion. And First Amendment, the very first clause is Congress will make no law on establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Right, that's the first freedom in the Bill of Rights, and I don't have any doubt that Ted Cruz will follow that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, moving on from that then, and I may refer back. The Pope has made some comments which Donald Trump seemed to have taken exception to, about fundamentally some of the views that Mr. Trump has been putting forward regarding things like immigration as not being suitable views for a Christian. What's your feeling on this, Elgin?
Well, that has been taken by our press, I think, incorrectly to mean that the Pope said that Cruz was not a Christian.
Sure.
And I don't think that's what the Pope said. And even saying that a Christian, someone who is a Christian has done. Oh, yeah, that can be. No, a liar is somebody who lies habitually, continually, not someone who has occasionally told a falsehood. And I think that distinction oftentimes gets dropped by a lot of people. As to the content of what he said, I know the one in particular was that that it's unchristian to build a wall, and I kind of found a bit of irony there, because the Vatican is surrounded by fairly high walls. So, there's every nation has the right to control its borders. If you can't control your borders, you're not a nation. And the idea that we have some sort of moral obligation to allow millions of people to come into this country without any control or anything about checking or anything like that. I mean, for example, Mexico complains a lot about it, but I think stat I heard recently, in the last 10 years, Mexico has allowed 1,500 people to immigrate into the country and become Mexicans. Mm-hmm. In this country, we allow about 1.5 million people a year to come in legally. We're not talking about immigration. America is a country of immigrants, and we have lots of immigrants, and we like immigrants. What we have a problem with is people who come across the border illegally. And it's a major source of crime. Sure, not everyone who comes over is a criminal. I think Trump did overstate that. But we do know that there are lots of people who come across who are criminals. We know it's a major source of the drug trade. There was a report recently that something like 80% of the women who come across the border get raped in the process, because they oftentimes have to go through what are called coyotes, the people who bring them across the border, and these are not, by definition, they're criminals. And we're not doing people a favor by letting them come across the desert. People in those area routinely come across human remains of people who died trying to make the journey, because most of that area is desert without any water. So we're not helping them by leaving the border open. And recently we had huge influx of children. We don't know how many were killed trying to do that. So it's not that we don't want immigrants. It's that we want immigration to be controlled and legal and go through some sort of uniform process. So we know who's here. We know why they're here. We can make sure, we're having, one of the problems in this country we're having is a reemergence of diseases that we thought we'd gotten rid of. and they're coming in because people come in with the diseases. No one knows they have them. The next thing you know, they're being spread throughout the population. Things like tuberculosis and other problems. So,
we of course happily have a moat around us, so that slightly reduces the problem, I suspect. But even there, Europe has a sea along its southern borders, and that is not stopping large amounts of immigration.
yeah.
Well,
Germany inviting them in hasn't helped much.
Well, Germany's welcoming once they get that far, shall we say. In order to get that far, they've got to get through some less than wholly inviting countries.
Yeah.
Greece can't cope with immigrants because it's broke in the first place. And then you've got to get through bits of the former Yugoslavia, which are not necessarily terribly immigrant friendly in some cases.
Yeah. And then you had the incidents in Cologne and
yes, indeed,
and just the increase of sexual assaults on women and mistreatment of women. I mean, it's there's a cultural issue because there's no assimilation that takes place, and people are bringing non-European values into Europe, and it's causing conflict.
True enough. I think there are some potential problems about assimilation. Assimilation tends to happen relatively slowly. It happens a lot less well if you have strong enclaves of an immigrant community, though we have always had, for instance, certain areas of London, Manchester, Leeds, which have had waves of immigrant communities, one after another, and it's been a different nationality of origin for the immigrant community. But it's always been the area where the immigrant community has been. And they have gradually, mostly, assimilated, but it has taken time. So, I mean, I think you have a point that there is a limited amount of immigration that a country can cope with. Have you exceeded it in the States, though? I mean, are you not making it too difficult for people to cross the Mexican border legally?
Well, I think there's a particular issue with the in the sense that up until the 1960s, we had something called the Bracero program, where it was a way for workers who didn't want to migrate to the United States, but wanted to come for seasonal labor, could come in and work and go home. And that was regulated. The employers had certain conditions placed on them, safety, health, things like that, that this was a regularized process. That was done away with. And at the same time, we brought in the 1965, they brought in a new immigration policy that was based more on families rather than on needs. So people could come to the United States because they had a relative in the United States, as opposed to wanting to become an American. We would have the enclave China. We had the Irish areas and things like that. People who came wanted to be Americans. They wanted to learn the language. They wanted to learn the culture. They liked being Americans. They thought coming to America was their chance. That's largely, or not largely, but that's somewhat disappeared. And with the huge influx of people coming in, I mean, a large part of people come in Southern California. My wife and I were looking for a house once. We decided not to buy it because it turned out being lived in already males. And the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, was my wife walked over to a closet, opened up the closet, and there was a guy sleeping on the floor. And what this was, it was a house used by seasonal workers. They would come up, and then they would just be, basically that was where they would sleep while they worked, and then they would go back to Mexico.
Mm.
And they were no interested. They have people now. You have Cinco de Mayo, which is a very popular holiday. You're not allowed to wear American flags on those days because that would be offensive to the Mexicans who were there. You have what's called the Reconquista movement, which is a movement within the southern western states, to return that back to Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's likely to happen because I don't think those states want to go back to Mexico. But you have these growing movements of large enclaves of people not in the process of assimilating, want to assimilate. And this is kind of my problem with multiculturalism, is because it celebrates other cultures but at the same time, downplaying to the point. I've asked people in my classes, what is it that is distinctive about America? Most of them have the foggiest idea. They really don't know, which is very disturbing.
That kind of surprises me. It surprises me less that a lot of people have no idea what it is that's distinctive about being British these days. Because in general terms, there seems to me rather less obviously pushed as being, this is the essence of Britishness. You can point to the Constitution and point to founding fathers and stories of the colonist past and so on. And ours is frankly rather remote these days, and also tends not to be taught in school anymore. Yeah, I do wonder.
The three values that describe America are liberty, in God we trust, and e pluribus unum, which means out of many, one. And it's the concept of the importance of liberty, the importance of God. Even though we have set up as a secular government, it was set up as a religious people with a secular government. And that division was originally put in not so people would have freedom from religion, but it would be freedom of religion. They wanted to make sure that government didn't use its power to suppress religion. And then out of many, that even though we come from many people and many nations, we are one people, Americans. And that's been weakened by, the whole concept, well, I'm an African American, I'm a this American or that American, or where we, and in this case, primarily the Democratic Party, plays specifically to groups of people. Everyone's divided up into little interest groups, and then we'll go to the this group, or we'll go to that group, or we'll go to that group, and we fragment everybody into sections. And then I come out and say, for example, all people are equal. I'm actually in some universities in California. I'm not allowed to say that because that would be considered racist or bigoted.
I find that a very difficult attitude to understand myself. But and this leads back to what we've been looking at, because obviously the initial setting up of the United States was against at least a perception of religious heritage which came from this country. And our situation was born out of, for instance, Henry VIII doing a Donald Trump with the Pope of the time.
First time I've ever heard those related.
Okay, in a way.
But
I'm saying...
I'm not disagreeing, by the way.
we are not going to be directed by a foreign power, even if it is the head of the entire Western Christian religion at the moment. And in effect, that set up the Anglican Church in the first place.
Yeah.
We then had the second shock to the system in our Civil War period, where the parliamentarians were for a while dominated by some extremely radical Protestant groups who did really popular things like banning singing, dancing, theatre, Christmas, and the like.
Yeah.
And we got
correct.
We got a horror of particular religious, in this case, flavors of Christian extremism in the country. I mean, until relatively recently, you couldn't take a full part in civil society if you're a Catholic. The only thing you're not allowed to do is marry the heir to the throne these days, if you're a Catholic. But as a result, the state was controlling the way the church was and ensuring that groups which would want dominance could not get that dominance. Now, going back to Cruz, as said, he's a Christian first and American second. Cruz has expressed some views which seem to me dominionist. It seems to be Christian exclusivist in much the same way as I've criticised in Modi in India, being Hindu only in India. I can see.
Can you give me an example?
I
I don't see that in Cruz at all. So I'm curious as to what you see as falling into that category.
can't pick out without going back to some.
Well, maybe you can do that for next week.
Maybe we can do that for next week. But he seems to be very much pushing Christianity as normative in more of a way than being the dominant actual religion, and one which, to me, actually goes rather beyond the freedom of religion amendment, and that worries me.
Okay.
From that point of view.
Yeah, if you can find an example, because I followed Cruz very closely, and quite frankly, out of the people that are emerging, I've been sort of neutral, but out of the people that are emerging, my first choice would be Cruz. I grant a large part of that is because I think he's the only one that can stop Trump at the moment. But even beyond that, I mean, he was always in my top tier of people. I would be happy with Cruz. I'd be happy with Rubio. I would have been happy with Ben Carson or Carly Fiorina, although those last two I don't think have any chance at all.
No.
Very leery about Rubio's chance. And quite frankly, I see at this point, if you add up the what I would consider the solid conservatives, they beat Trump easily. But what's happening is because there's so many of them, they divide up the vote, and Trump is allowed to win with 35%. And as long as they stay in the race and divide up the vote, I mean, I've seen this many, many times in my lifetime over many elections where there's been a couple of candidates I like, but they split the vote, and the candidate I don't like ends up getting in. So I see that whole thing happening again now with Trump. I'm hoping at this point people drop out so that we get down to a single candidate that can oppose them.
Hey, I thought that was what the caucus system was supposed to do, actually, but you never know. Anyhow, I have one last item at this point, which is a development here. There's a plan from government to make it illegal for any publicly funded body to enter into a boycott or similar avoidance of contract with someone that they don't consider ethical, which has been something which particularly councils have done regularly all over the country. To my view, this is making it illegal for a public body, whether or not it has its own democratic mandate, which of course councils do, to pursue a divestment policy, and indeed to follow an ethical investment policy. I mean, I have worries from an English legal point of view that if it becomes illegal for entities like councils to avoid investment in, for instance, companies that are in the arms trade or which are employing slave labour or that kind of thing, then we will find that spreads to normal companies. And we do have some companies which pride themselves on their ethical investment strategy. I can see a shareholder action against the board of directors if they do that, saying councils are not able to avoid investing in these companies. You shouldn't be allowed to either. Have you any feelings on this? I know there's nothing similar in the States at the moment.
Yeah, I'm against it. So my point of view is, by the way, I disagree with most of the divestment movements. They tend to be on the left, and if I divested from everything I disagreed with, I wouldn't be able to exist in the society. I mean, I couldn't go to a movie. I don't like most of Hollywood values. I don't like a lot of what they do. I don't like the actresses or the actors in terms of their politics, but I'll go support their movies because if they're a good actor, that's what matters to me when I watch the film. Mm-hmm. So I'm not real big on divestment to begin with. But that said, I believe in freedom, and I believe people have a right to choose either directly themselves or through their governing bodies what they want to invest in and what they don't want to invest in. So I think there's certain, to me, it's one of these issues. There's certain things I think everybody would agree with that government probably shouldn't be investing into. Somebody in the slave trade, for example, that would be a pretty clear example.
Yep.
On the other hand, there's probably groups that we would question anybody should divest from. Mm-hmm. But in the middle, there's going to be a lot of difference, and I would prefer public bodies not get involved in such things, but or very cautiously get involved.
Yeah.
I know one of the really big ones at the moment is divestment out of Israel, and I'm strongly opposed to that. But if somebody wants to do that, that's that comes under the heading of liberty.
Yes, I'm certainly strongly in favor of people being able to do it. And actually, insofar as Israel is using facilities in the occupied West Bank, I'm probably in favor of divestment as well, because I do not like Israel's intransigence on that topic. I don't particularly like the Palestinians' intransigence on it either, but
there's nothing to divest from there.
There's nothing to divest from in that case. No, exactly so. So yeah, I do not like cramping people's freedom to make that kind of decision at all. And on one of these rare notes of agreement, we've got ourselves to 11 o'clock at the moment. Have you any last points, Elgin?
No, I think that's I think we blabbered on enough.
I think we have to. Thanks for coming, and I'll be signing off now. I hope you've enjoyed this week's. Have a good week, and look forward to seeing you next week.